Imagine you live in a city where rents are skyrocketing. You need to find a place for you and your child before winter comes. After 2 months of searching, you find a place that you can barely believe is still standing. But your fear of freezing on the streets outweighs the fear you feel when you saw the boarded up windows, the mildew, or the traces of mice. There are no shelter beds open. And Minnesota's cold is deadly. But you grit your teeth and you sign the lease because you have no choice. This is the city where most of us live, but not all of us are experiencing it that way. My name is Dr. Brittany Lewis. I'm a social justice action researcher. I collaborate with communities to ensure their stories lead to real change. And in my research, I found that access to safe, dignified, affordable housing harms far too many people. Whether they are facing wrongful eviction, seeking affordable housing, or shelter from domestic violence. Choice is an illusion for the unhoused. In the United States, 18 out of 10,000 people are experiencing houselessness. And I use the term houselessness as a sign of dignity. Because you might not have a home, but you are creating home in many other ways. And although white folks make up half of this population, Black and brown people are disproportionately impacted by this epidemic. But why? From the strategic deconstruction of low-income neighborhoods in the name of slum clearance, to mortgage brokers steering Black and brown folks to subprime loans. There's a long history of systemic oppression, created racial housing inequities that persist today. Unfortunately, many people keep reproducing the harmful idea that unhoused people failed to make good choices causing their circumstance. The idea that everyone has the same access to sufficient choices for safe, affordable, dignified housing is simply not true. This idea has been weaponized against Black and brown communities. When we center the voices of people harmed by housing injustice, we see how institutions and systems eliminate their choices. And let me be crystal clear for you right now. Institutions and systems are led by people like me and you. My groundbreaking research has confirmed this. My work has won a Minnesota Supreme Court case to extend rights for tenants. My work has been used to eliminate the self-pay policy in Hennepin County. My work created city protection ordinances in the city of Minneapolis. And it supported the creation of the first office of missing and murdered Black women and girls in this country. So when we center the stories of people harmed, we have to ask ourselves why my projects have successfully moved the needle on the problem most folks believe can't be solved. I'm not the only one that can do this work, y'all. It's because I know the power and necessity of centering the stories of people who have lived experience and treat them like experts. Using my equity in action process, I ensure that people like me and you who work in systems listen to the stories and co-create solutions with those most impacted. They are the experts. Let's treat them that way. And making change requires that we all play a role. I ask you to consider the role you play in the housing ecosystem. As I share 3 stories with you today from 2 of my research studies, pay close attention to how you or the institutions you support either expand or constrict choices for the unhoused in these stories. Because everyday people like me and you carry out the strategies of institutions and systems that impact housing choices. How you show up and use your different levels of influence and power is key to making more choices available to the people who are seeking safe, dignified, affordable housing. But we first must change the narrative. Choice is an illusion for the single Black mother who moved into the property owned by a slumlord to avoid going back to shelter with her 2 children, where she felt unsafe. The landlord frequently pursued her for sex, trying to bribe her with reduced rent because he knew she was financially struggling. She and I cried together. And when she talked about the fear she felt when he would show up to her house unannounced. When she refused his sexual advances, he retaliated by filing multiple unlawful detainers in the courts. The filings rendered her ineligible to apply in the traditional housing market at all. So let's dive into the role people play in this story and the limited choices made available to those on the brink of houselessness. In my role as an action researcher, I advocated, facilitated, and collaborated with tenants being evicted from North Minneapolis to produce a research study guided by community-articulated needs. The slumlord chose to use financial advantage and legal savvy to exploit his tenant. His decision to harass this woman was made easy by the court system that privileges a legal filing over the story of a tenant. The landlord knew the court would be blind to his acts unless she was able to find legal representation to fight the detainer. The single Black woman's choices were limited by these actors and institutions at every turn. A lack of affordable housing stock, inadequate family shelters, and a court system that makes decisions that cannot be easily refused or repealed ignored her needs and dismissed her. All of these institutions are led and supported by everyday people like me and you. Choice is an illusion for the single elderly Black man who had just completed a rehab program and had signed his first lease. But soon after, the city came to condemn that building and gave him 15 minutes to grab his belongings. The day I met him, he told me that all he wanted to do was have a drink. But instead, he checked himself into the psych ward. After our interview, I collaborated with a legal aid attorney to find him an open shelter bed. So let's dive into the role people played in this story and what choices were made available to those on the brink of houselessness. The attorney and we'd worked together as social justice actors to ensure that this gentleman had somewhere to go, which was made very difficult to be a single adult and homeless in the streets. But most importantly, we wanted to disrupt the relapse. The city and its code enforcement staff play a role in ensuring buildings are safe for people to live in. But they actually deeply trust landlords to comply with regulations until deadlines pass and complaints are made. The landlord chooses when and how to maintain the buildings. The landlord chose to delay repairs. The landlord chose to collect application fees and first month's rent from new tenants, despite knowing that the city could come and condemn that building at any moment. Like the slumlord in the first story, the property owner chose to exploit tenants until the slow-moving system caught up to their neglect. The shelter plays a role, helping people in need, but dependent on government or philanthropic organizations to provide funds to keep their doors open. And those grants are not sufficient, especially for single adults who are houseless. The single elderly Black man's choices for safe housing were limited within a housing system that ignored his needs until it was too late. All the institutions and systems are led and endorsed by people like me and you. Choice is an illusion for the Black woman living in a rural county trying to escape her longtime abusive partner. On average, it takes 7 attempts to leave an abusive partner. Each time she made the long trip to the nearest domestic violence shelter, she encountered a mostly white female staff that judged her choices and favored white victims. When I led a focus group with Black women in such a shelter, they discussed forming their own support group to address the lack of cultural competency of the all-white staff. I thanked that Black woman during that focus group. She alone was holding space for younger Black women survivors, even while she sought out the shelter for her own safety. Let's dive into the roles people play in this story and what choices were really made available to those on the brink of houselessness. The abuser chose to use economic and psychological leverage to act out their pain on an isolated woman. The shelter staff chose to shame a Black woman survivor rather than meet her with compassion. State agencies and philanthropic organizations have chosen not to provide funds to increase bed space or train staff to understand survivors from different ethnic or racial backgrounds. The Black woman domestic violence victim faced limited choices in a system that determined she was not worthy of shelter at all. All of these institutions that she tried to navigate are led by people like me and you. We can all relate to wanting to protect our children from unsafe environments. We can all relate to the pride that comes along with overcoming obstacles. We can all certainly relate to having hard times in our lives where our support networks did not judge us, but instead embraced us with compassion. Those are the same experiences that those at our houses are actively pursuing while processing grief, trauma, pain, with little to no economic resources or systemic recourse. Vulnerable people are struggling to find housing in an ecosystem that forces them to contend with slumlords, under-resourced shelters, and culturally biased staff. Choice is an illusion for the unhoused, and we need to stop operating as if houseless people had any good options to choose from in the first place. Today, I ask everyone listening to my talk to do 2 things. First, work with me to change this narrative that those experiencing houselessness simply failed to make good choices. Second, I ask you to question the things you do not understand about houselessness with curiosity, not condemnation. I invite us all to take a closer look at the role we each play in the ecosystem and question whether we are receiving and believing the hard truths that those most impacted are telling us. When we do not receive and believe the stories of impacted community members, we are getting in the way of finding the best solutions to the housing crisis. When you hear their stories, be ready to move through any discomfort you have if their words contradict your prior beliefs about housing choice. That is your work to do. And this is a necessity if we want to generate a system with more choices for the people I talked about today. Everyday people like me and you must be bold enough to model a different way of being in partnership and relationship with impacted community members. By changing the narrative, we sound the alarms of change, motivating people all across the world to commit their lives to advocating for and creating lasting practice and policy change with the unhoused. And it's people like me and you that have the tools to do that work. And until that happens, choice will continue to be an illusion for the unhoused. Thank you.